It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Monica Turner. I guess she also pointed out it's her great pleasure to be here because it's 60 degrees warmer here right now than it is in Madison. But I could go on and on with Monica's accomplishments, but I'll try and keep this very, very brief. She is one of the leaders in landscape ecology, one of the co-editors-in-chief since it was founded of the journal Landscape Ecology. She is a member of the National Academy. She's a winner of the MacArthur Award from the Ecological Society. She is also president-elect of the Ecological Society, so we're really lucky to get her here before she's way too busy. Also would like to thank the Storer Endowment who is sponsoring this visit. And Monica will be talking to us about landscape in transition, climate change, and disturbance regimes in Greater Yellowstone, something which is very timely in California, given the fact that it has not been raining.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for the nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you and to the Storer Committee. And to everyone that I've met with today, it's been really fun. I've just had wonderful discussions with faculty and students and such, so thank you. So I, at the outset, just recognize that the work I'm talking about today is collaborative, so I have had a number of students and colleagues that I have worked with and funding sources. So we all know that natural disturbances are really key in many systems. So out here you have your array, but almost any landscape or ecosystem that you go to has disturbance as a key role in it. And we've learned a lot about that over the past couple of decades within ecology. We also now recognize that disturbance regimes are really changing. So for example, the total area burned in the US has been going up a lot since the last couple of decades. That's true for areas in California as well. Bark beetle outbreaks, which is another thing that's happening just a little bit east of you that has gotten a lot of attention, have increased in their extent and severity and synchronicity in recent years. And there's a climate component to all of these things. So we've recognized particularly since Tony or Leroy's Westerling's paper that came out in Science, that for the first time made a very good, strong link between the changing climate in the western US, the warmer temperatures, earlier spring snowmelt, and longer fire seasons that were associated with the increases in large fires and areas burned. So there's a linkage between all of these things, and that's the context in which I'm going to talk to you today. So I get to talk about my favorite place to go do research, which is Yellowstone, the other Y National Park. Lots of people will say to me, oh yeah, you do all that work out in Yosemite. I'm like, no, it's Yellowstone. They're both big and famous. I'm going to introduce introduce disturbances in Yellowstone, then focus on the role of climate change with a couple of questions. How might fires change in the future under climate change? What will post-fire recovery look like? And will we see potential differences in forest resilience? And I'll go through this in detail and then conclude. So introducing you first to disturbances in Yellowstone, and first to Yellowstone. So how many of you have been there? Probably most of you, because it's not that far from here, even though the West is big. So you know it's located up in the northern Rockies, up in the northwest corner of Wyoming, centered kind of on Yellowstone Lake, and surrounded by a lot of national forest and wilderness types of lands. It's really well known for all of its features. So my favorite geyser is Grand, one of the really big ones in the Upper Geyser Basin. And for Yellowstone Lake, and of course for the wildlife that are out there as well. But it's also covered by a lot of really cool forests. And the forest cover dominates most of Yellowstone Park proper. Lodgepole pine is the dominant tree species. We also have spruce and fir. And at lower elevations, a bit more of the open Rocky Mountain Douglas fir and aspen. Fire has long been a part of that system. The natural fire regime in Yellowstone is one of large fires. They're infrequent, they're high severity. They kill the trees and the forest comes back. So they're stand-replacing fires. They occur at intervals of about 100 to 300 years. That's been documented over about the past 10,000 years. So it's an infrequent, big, severe fire natural regime that is driven primarily by climate. So those of you who are familiar with some of the top-down, bottom-up, this is a top-down, largely controlled fire regime. Now, in 1988, when I was a new PhD, a recent graduate, there happened to be really big fires that provided a wonderful opportunity for someone interested in landscape ecology to study the patterns that were created in the landscape. So I have been working there since 1988. So those fires burned under very severe drought, very high winds. In case this myth persists, they were not caused by fire suppression. This is not a system in which suppression has changed fuels. Ultimately, they affected about 40% of the park. They were very large. They burned through forests of all age. They burned across things like the canyon of Yellowstone. And they were ultimately stopped by snow in mid-September, although suppression efforts were implemented in July. Now, you don't have to read this. This is just to say we've studied the consequences of these fires a lot. We've done a ton of work. This is a picture showing the depiction of the perimeters of the fires. We've looked at all sorts of things about them, many of us, and basically what we've learned is that system was extremely resilient. That is, it recovered just fine without intervention, even though the fires were big and severe. And so just to illustrate some of this, so the vegetation recovered quickly. This is a photo I took in October of '88. It looks like there's nothing there. But by the next year, we have little tree seedlings germinating. 2 years after the fires, we had profuse flowering of the herbaceous vegetation. And 15 years after the fire, we've got lots of little trees all over. So this is without intervention. We had extremely abundant regeneration of lodgepole pine. It varied spatially from low densities where we didn't have serotinous trees to extremely high densities. These are survivors. And any of you foresters would be horrified at this number. This is not a number of trees that any forester would like to see, over 400,000 per hectare. So we have lots of variation spatially. This is in part because the trait of bearing serotinous cones that release their seeds when heated varies among the trees. That's a genetically controlled trait. So if you have high serotiny, you get this. And then within the fires were really complex. This is why it was so fun to study as a landscape ecologist. This very complex mosaic of burned and unburned areas is also associated with some variability in the regeneration. So we understand the processes. And again, we had plenty of good regeneration. Bottom line of 25 years of study is resilience. Like the big disturbances, the system can really handle it just fine. Now, the other disturbance I wanted to mention, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the beetles, but they've gotten a lot of interest throughout the West, are bark beetles. They're native to Yellowstone, so in addition to fire, the system is also affected by beetles. And they're shown here, the little larvae here under the bark, and they have affected extensive areas of the western U.S. The females burrow into the tree. They lay their eggs at the bottom, and then they create these characteristic J-shaped galleries. They lay their eggs along the way. The larvae hatch, and then they burrow out laterally, and they girdle the tree, just as simply. They're native species. They're always present, but they're often in an endemic phase where they're at low densities, but then they periodically come out at an epidemic phase, which is related also to climate conditions, and they can produce extensive mortality of big trees, not little trees, and not everything. So in Yellowstone, these are maps produced by Heather Lynch some years ago. The colors are just different years, but they show little maps of Yellowstone indicating the extent of bark beetle outbreak up through the 1980s. So there was an outbreak in the 70s and 80s as well. So this has also been in the system for a long time. In the beginning of the 2000s, there was a synchronous outbreak of many different beetle species. They're host-specific, so a particular beetle will feed primarily only on one particular host tree. And so these were largely on national forest lands surrounding Yellowstone, but it raised a lot of questions about what that was going to add to the landscape. Just to show you, this is what they look like. So it's a fine-grained disturbance. They kill the trees, but not all of them. But these are different beetle species in different host trees throughout Yellowstone. And the sequence follows a multi-year sequence or duration. So fires come through very quickly. Beetles take about 4 or 5 years to go through their process of killing the trees. There's a phase where the tree needles are still on the trees and they're red, dry, flammable. They shed here. So there's less fuel in the canopy, and then eventually you have the standing snags remaining. The big question that has come out that's been a hot topic is throughout the West is what would be the interaction between the beetle outbreaks and the subsequent consequences for fire. There's been particular interest in whether fires would become more severe, like they would go from surface into the crown, or whether the risk of active crown fire would worsen. So I'm not going to go through all the details on that, but I can talk to you subsequently. And just to say that this is, again, a series of disturbances and disturbance interactions that we've been well studied. And the bottom line is that, again, substantial ecosystem resilience, both from the forest to the beetle outbreak, and then also to subsequent fires that come out. There's a nice summary that came out in Science on this issue just a few months back. So the disturbances in Yellowstone, they're abundant, they structure the landscape, and I would argue that after all the work we've been doing, they are not ecologically catastrophic. They might be perceived that way to human interests at times, but as an ecological event, they aren't. Now, in the meantime, however, the climate's been changing. So we know, we've all seen the temperature graphs of this sort. And so what does that mean, and how would climate change affect the system? So we started thinking about this quite a while ago, before we had really the evidence that we have now for climate change and understanding the rates and the dynamics. And so the first paper Bill Rami and I wrote came out in 1991 in Conservation Biology, looking at the implications of global climate change for Yellowstone. At this point, it was really a heuristic. We were thinking ahead about what might happen. And I just hit the button again. And we talked about how a drier climate would increase fire activity, but we really didn't know how and in what ways. It would reduce stand age, because if you burn more, you're going to have younger forests throughout the landscape. It could shift vegetation upslope in ways that all of us are familiar with. So we embarked on a series of modeling studies involving collaborators, colleagues, ourselves, did a whole bunch of them. I've listed several here. Basically, got what we thought was a big hammer. I mean, took the fire regime and said, okay, what if fires happen twice as frequently? Or, we pushed it as far as we could within what we know fire has varied throughout the Holocene, throughout the past 10,000 years. We've done it spatially. We've done it with climate-fire interactions. We did all sorts of things. And basically, no matter what we did, the forest recovered under simulations. We recognize, well, the system has changed in the past. It's going to change in the future. We know the 1988 fires were fine. So we thought, well, we've kind of got this thing tied up, right? We've got it nicely tied up in a knot. And so I've spent 20 years saying, Yellowstone is resilient. We can change everything. We've changed it in the past. It's going to come back just fine. It's well adapted to a warming climate. But then we started to get the or is it component. And what really did this for me was seeing pictures of these are particular maps, actually, that I borrowed from Leroy, showing the 1988 pattern of moisture deficit in the West. So the red is the really dry area. You can see it centered on Yellowstone when we had the big fires. And the current projections for climate that showed by the end of the century that the moisture deficit would look worse than that throughout most of the West. And so that was a level of climate change that we had never considered before, despite all of the other things that we had been doing thus far. So that suggested that the climate like 88 would be the norm rather than the exception. And that, honestly, conceptually to me was quite a shock. I remember talking with him and saying, I don't think that could possibly happen. And him saying, well, why not? Well, it hasn't happened for 10,000 years. Well, why do you think it couldn't happen in the future? So it actually really got us thinking about what some of the actual projections would be like. So that left us saying, well, okay, if we have a future climate that's really warm, we know that increased fire activity is likely. However, how does that translate into what might really happen? How many fires does that mean? How much area would burn? When would that happen? Where would it happen? What are the ecological implications? So it was a whole new way of looking at things than what we had done previously. So we, with Tony, I still call him Tony, even though he would prefer to be called Leroy. So I'll bounce between them. I don't know how many of you know Leroy. But we began, whoops, hopefully you can still hear me. I'm not sure how I hit that. a study with some funding with Joint Fire Science to look at Yellowstone and ask how might the occurrence, size, and spatial location of fires change under the anticipated projected climates that we had from the GCMs. And so what we did on this, and I'm not going to go through the gory details with it at all. It's been published, and again, I'd be happy to show you, but it's a statistical approach. So we developed and tested statistical models that relate climate to fire activity throughout the entire Northern Rockies. Remember I said in the beginning, these are events that happen with 1 to 300 year intervals, so you don't get a lot of them. So you have to sample from a large area to get a large enough sample to build models that are robust. And it's a series of steps where you model first the probability of fire occurrence, secondly the number of fires, and then the size of the fires. And then apply the statistical models to the projections of climate. So the assumption is that the relationship between the forests and the climate and the fire is stationary. There's no reason for that to be expected to change. However, there's no feedbacks from vegetation to fire in here, which we recognize. So predict that in the next century. So basically, we're taking fires from throughout the entire Northern Rockies to develop the models, test the predictions for the Northern Rockies and Yellowstone, so the perimeter shown here, and then working forward. So what do we see? First of all, for climate, and I'm really just showing these for the general trends, so don't worry about the particulars. The GCMs that are used are ones that perform well for this part of the world, so they're ones that we know can reproduce the historical situation well. And what we see here for Yellowstone is that by the end of the century, we're expected to see 4 to 6 degree increases in spring-summer temperature, which is when fire season occurs. And this is related to an increase in drought, so water deficit also increases. So even though precipitation isn't changing a lot, the temperature drives the drying conditions. Okay, and the models agree reasonably well on this. So when you project it out to the entire Yellowstone landscape, and I'll take a minute just to explain this because then I'll show it to you for each of the models, what we did was to run 1,000 simulations so that you can get the probability distribution of the events because they're infrequent events, so it's difficult to predict exactly. So what these graphs show, there's a log scale for area. This is the amount of the 1988 fires, and then that's all of Yellowstone. So remember, it's on a log scale. And then the historical record is in the turquoise. The median area burned is in the dashed line, and then there's the interquartile and full range. So you can see the entire range of distributions, and you can look at the median. So this is just for one of the models, but what you can see is that there end up being very few years with no fire, which used to be quite common. The median area burned steadily increases, and by mid-century, you're burning potentially an area as large as the 88 fires. The way to interpret this is to say the weather conditions are such that you could burn that. So it's not actually saying that it would burn because there's no vegetation feedback that's built in. But basically this says climate will no longer limit fires in that system potentially. So this is the same, we just looked at this middle one. All of the models end up producing similar kinds of behaviors. There's a little bit difference in the timing, but they all get to the same place. And by mid-century, we start seeing pretty big changes in what's happening. So large fires occur much more often. Minimum area burned per year increases, and it's a very different fire regime, potentially, than you would expect. So now what does it look like when you splay it out on the landscape? That was just the aggregate. And so what we've done there is modeled the fire rotation, which is like a fire return interval, but not exact, because some places might burn twice, some might not at all, but within your area, it's how long does it take to burn an area the size of interest. So we've done it for the cells. So here's the perimeter of Yellowstone. And then this is the output. So the colors here, these are each of the 3 GCMs. I realize this is a complex figure. The colors relate to the fire rotation. The blues are over 100 years, over 120 years, which matches. So in the historical time period, 1960s to 1990s, we know the fire return interval has been 100 to 300 years, and that's consistent with the fire rotation. By the time we get to the mid-century, the fire rotation starts to drop down into the 60 year or 30 to 90 year range. And by the end of the century, climate conditions are such that you could have the whole area burning in 30 years. Now, of course, there would be transitions because your fuels would no longer be there. But the climate conditions would change really substantially. So this is a much greater magnitude of change than we had ever considered. So one of the questions I got today from the graduate students is, have I had an experience where things that I've said have changed as the science has evolved? This is it. I mean, after saying, you know, don't worry, Yellowstone's fine, and now I'm really not quite so sure. I think that there could be very substantial changes in the offing. So novel fire regime relative to the Holocene, much greater predicted change than anyone had previously observed or suggested. It suggests large fires would be much more frequent. Years without fire become rare. The minimum burned area each year would increase, and we would flip eventually from a climate-limited to a fuel-limited regime. So climate would no longer be limiting to the fires. So what does this then translate into recovery or resilience? Or how would the system change if this kind of thing happened? And it's actually really difficult to answer this because, again, we don't have the opportunity to experiment with systems that have these kinds of spatial temporal dynamics. So when I speak about resilience, I'm talking about the capacity of the system to recover, so succession to take place and the system to recover, such that you are staying qualitatively in the same kind of state. So a forest is still a forest, and you're kind of governed by very similar sets of processes. So because it's really difficult to assess this, we've been starting to look at it by mechanisms, thinking about in what ways could these kinds of changes in both fire regime and in climate alter the ability of a forest to recover. So I'm going to talk about three, and this is work that we're currently doing. So it's very much in the directions that we're moving towards, trying to assess what the implications would be for the region. So I'm going to talk about changes in fire frequency, fire size, and then warmer, drier conditions in the time periods after the fires. So for increased fire frequency, it's related to the duration of time it takes for the trees to be producing cones so that you have a seed source relative to the return interval. So we could have the change in fire frequency alter qualitatively the ability of the forest to recover if the frequency of stand replacing fire occurs so that the fire intervals are less than what is required to have a cone crop present. Now, if we have long interval fires, which is what most of the post-1988 fire condition was like, we have mature trees, we often have serotinous cones, and we get this robust recovery as we saw. However, if we have short interval fires, which we're just starting to have because the areas that burned in 1988 are occasionally now reburning, which is interesting from the standpoint of studying. So this is a fire that burned, the Signet fire just burned in 2012. It's in an area where the trees were not producing any cones. And after the 1988 fires, we had 11,000 trees per hectare. When those trees reburned in the absence of a seed source, we've had a 98% reduction in what is now coming back in. And for lodgepole pine, they come in very quickly after fire, so the early data are good indicators. So the reburn, as we call them, before cone production is there, is reducing the capacity to recover. What's also interesting is that in one of the other fires, the Boundary Fire, burned at a 12-year fire return interval. And I should say that those fires are not supposed to happen. So the common conventional wisdom is that these young stands shouldn't burn. So usually people consider those to be kind of fire breaks. But this area burned when it was only 12 years after the 1988 fires. Seedling aspen, which is an interesting side story, but aspen established by seed, not from resprouting after the 88 fires, but they were present when this area burned at age 12. The pine trees weren't producing cones, the aspen were there so they could resprout. So not only do we have a reduction in lodgepole pine, because again there was no seed source, the aspen were able to take care of that and recover. So now we have aspen taller than me, which is not super tall, but this is still not wonderful aspen growing environment. So we have a switch in species abundance as well. So what about fire size? So if fires are getting bigger, which there's some evidence to suggest that the area that burns as crown fire is getting larger, if we have species that don't have a seed bank, so they don't have the serotinous cones that lodgepole pine have, then they need to disperse in from seed sources. And so we can have increased patch sizes, reducing tree regeneration if the sizes are exceeding the dispersal distances for the trees that are there. So we're also seeing some evidence for this. For Douglas fir, which you guys have out here as well, but it doesn't seed bank, it has to disperse in. It also produces an annual crop of seed each year. We are seeing a decline in the density of Douglas fir as you move away. This is 1988 fire data from survivors. And data that Dan Donato is working up right now shows a decline with distance from seed source. And we've seen evidence from this in some of our other study areas as well. The third way that we've been giving a lot of thought to as well is that the conditions after the fire, which is when the trees are having to establish, germinate, and grow, that could also be having a big influence on whether the forest can recover. So warmer, drier conditions for a couple of years later could reduce tree regeneration, even if you had seeds present, or if not, if they were able to disperse there, the environmental conditions could still reduce it. So warm, dry conditions in the years after the fire could depress tree establishment, even if seeds are abundant. So a mature forest can tolerate a lot greater range of environmental conditions. So the big trees, if it's a droughty summer, they can shut down, but they don't all die. But a regenerating tree seedling, just like in our gardens, we have to baby them, has a much narrower range of conditions that it can persist through. So we have seen evidence for this as well in some data that we were actually pretty perplexed with at the beginning. But we had another fire in the greater Yellowstone area. This is actually down on the Grand Tetons, but an area is quite comparable to what burned in Yellowstone. Burned in the summer of 2000. And in 2001, we had only a third of the climate normals for precipitation. It was a very droughty summer, and 2001 was another big fire year throughout the Rocky Mountains as well. And what we had found was very similar spatial patterns of high versus lower densities of trees, but just drastically lower. So in areas correcting for serotiny, correcting for fire severity that we know, we had 98% less tree establishment in crown fires and 95% less in severe surface fires in the glade fire than we had in the 1988 fires. And again, we couldn't figure that out for a while until we started thinking more about the climate conditions. And one of my current finishing up PhD students, Brian Harvey, has done a really nice job of testing for this effect throughout the entire northern Rocky regions. So sampling in areas from Yellowstone to Glacier, sampling a variety of fires that were followed by either wet or dry subsequent years. And this took a huge effort, both to find the right fires with the weather conditions and then to go out in these remote areas. And I'm not going to go through all of these results. This manuscript is in prep. It should be submitted within the next couple of weeks. But we have an extremely strong signal of post-fire drought among all of the various factors that we have looked at. And this panel here, the two that are in red are the ones I want to show you. On the y-axis is the density of reestablishing trees. On the x-axis here is an indicator of drought severity. And as drought severity goes up, the regeneration of the trees following the fires goes right down. In addition, and consistent with this, if you look at aspect and slope position, if you are on the more moist northerly slopes, aspects, then reestablishment is elevated. So that's the strongest signal, and that's region-wide. So we think that there's evidence showing up already that some of the variation we're seeing in climate is having an effect. We're also in the process of doing some experimental work to see if we can assess the germination and establishment success for the dominant tree species in Yellowstone in a post-fire environment in different climates. This is also a little tricky to do. So Winslow Hansen is conducting this work. It's in progress. We have the first year's pilot data, but it's fully implemented now. And so we're taking soil cores from recently burned forests, and then transplanting, either planting them again in place, and then we're planting a set number of seeds, or transplanting them to locations where the climate today is what is projected for mid-century up in the area of the lodgepole pine forest. And so far, we're seeing a decline in the initial data of actually no germination in areas at lower elevation where that climate is out there. So we're trying to get at some of the mechanisms that collectively could lead to large changes. So I've talked to you about 3 different mechanisms that we think, with the changes in fire regime and climate, could actually lead to substantial changes in the forests in Yellowstone, but also in other places of the Rocky Mountains. When you put this together, you can think about it in these kind of stability ball and cup sorts of diagrams, where if we think about the historical condition being our conifer forest that we have in Yellowstone, and if we have stand replacing fires, the ball stays in the cup and the system is stable, and we have a non-forest or perhaps a deciduous forest in this region. So this is kind of where we think things have been for the past 10,000 years. And potentially by mid-century, if some of these mechanisms come into play that affect the regeneration, the increased size and frequency and severity of fire, plus the warmer climate, which kind of makes that cup more shallow, could potentially cause a critical transition or a tipping point into non-forest types of conditions. So whether this will happen, I don't know, but I think it's a plausible scenario that could affect much of our region. Now, that doesn't mean that forests would go away. We would still have landscapes that were extensively forested in many places. It doesn't mean that native species would be lost. We might see more open types of forested areas than we see now in the area of Yellowstone. But it still would mean some pretty substantial changes, probably in forest extent, forest age, and the distribution of it spatially. So I would say that one of our key lessons from the 25 years of research on natural disturbances in Yellowstone was resilience. And I think we have very strong evidence that the system was just fine following that. Now, it's possible that that fire may be a benchmark against which we measure the recovery of the system to future fire events and compare it and end up measuring deviations. Because I think it's very possible that the past won't predict the future. I think that the forest resilience in Yellowstone may well be compromised by increased warming and the altered fire regime. Again, reminder that I'm not saying Yellowstone will be destroyed. I'm not saying we'll lose all of the native species, but I think changes could be much greater than what we had anticipated in the past. Again, forest age, type, extent, and location may change. And if these are kind of general sorts of mechanisms that I think would be potentially at play in other locations, including Sierra Nevada and some of the areas in Yellowstone. I think it's a big challenge to us as ecologists, for me who works in forests or works at large scales, to anticipate when, where, and why we might see these qualitative changes or these ecosystem transitions in the future. And I think it's a key to understanding the future of our forests. So with that, I would be happy to take questions or talk about any of this further. So I keep hitting the mic.
You mentioned the genetic variability in lodgepole pine. I wonder if something could be going on like might be going on with heavy fishing, where there'll be selection for shorter life histories, where tiny little trees would produce just a few cones. Do you see that kind of variability in lodgepole pine now that it be selected for?
So we're actually monitoring some of that in the post-88 fire area. And it's, I don't have a good answer to that, Don, but I think it's possible because we think that the fire regime is the force that has selected for serotiny or not serotiny in lodgepole. And it hasn't been demonstrated genetically, but when you have long fire intervals that are longer than the anticipated lifespan of an individual, you don't have much serotiny. And when fire intervals are shorter than anticipated lifespan, you have a lot. I had always been taught that lodgepole pine don't produce serotinous cones until they're at least 40 years old. That's not true. We have found them in the very young trees, and very small trees can be producing cones, very few per individual tree, but when you multiply by 100,000 trees, there's a lot of cones there. And in the larger trees that are producing more cones per tree at the stand level don't have as many. So I think indeed there could very well be selection that happens for rapidly producing your cones, because if you have the serotinous ones, that's what's going to get you reestablished. So I think that lodgepole pine is still going to persist in a lot of places on account of that as well. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I guess you were noting that one piece that isn't in the modeling is that with less fuel, even warmer, drier might not start fires that go as far. But in the last 25 years since the 1988 fire, you noted a couple of fires. Were there quite a few others that, had an opportunity, lightning started something, but then you actually a direct study of lack of fuel because it hasn't fully recovered meant that it didn't really spread very far or anything like that? What have you got?
So there's two ways to answer that. So one is that when conditions are extreme enough, the fire will spread through areas that have very little fuel. And so in 1988, I actually did the analyses that looked at the, not fuel measures directly, but the age of the forest to look for effects of that. Early in the season, before the fire conditions were as extreme, the fires dropped down when they got to younger forests. And that was what had been observed in the natural fire policy from 72 to 88. So it's a relatively small window. And then later in the summer, it ignored it completely. It was so dry and the winds were so strong, there was no effect of the variation in fuel. So you can see it under many years where the fires will drop down. But the extreme years, which are the ones that give you the largest area burned, the differences in fuels matter remarkably little. Now, in terms of whether or not we've seen much in the way of reburns, and that's in the Yellowstone system, I should say. So what I'm saying, I'm talking about Yellowstone, and please don't apply to your system that I don't know much about. The other thing that we've done is taken a look using the remote sensing data for areas that have reburned over the record since they've been putting out the information from Landsat. And so Brian Harvey, my PhD student, is working on that at the moment. I don't remember the estimate for the Rocky Mountain region wide of what the area is that has reburned. It's not a ton, but it is enough to go back out and study to look at actual regeneration. But again, we often have to go to large areas. In Yellowstone, we haven't had enough fire years subsequently that were really big that have given us the opportunity to see those kinds of dynamics, which is kind of interesting just because Yellowstone is our largest wilderness area in the lower 48. And it's still not quite large enough to get enough of a sample of different kinds of conditions that allow you to test all of that within that area. So I think it's on the whole, it's still a work in progress. Yes?
Are the fires, the ignition starting in grasslands or the forest, and is the relative amount of grassland likely to change as well? Where the fires actually getting going?
So the fires are starting, they can start in either places, but they often start in the forest. So most of the area in Yellowstone is forest. It's in Yellowstone Park, it's about 80%. And lightning is the primary source of ignition. In terms of the grasslands, one of the things that was very interesting after the 88 fires is the distribution of forest versus grassland did not change. And we were kind of surprised, and I don't have an answer for that, but whether or not there's feedbacks in the soil or the mat of the grasses was such, it's so dense, because in many cases you're just burning off the tops of things, so maybe the seeds couldn't establish. I'm not really quite sure what that is. However, we are starting to see at the lower elevations areas that are not recovering as forest following, say, the recent beetle outbreaks and things like that. So I think that we would see an increase in kind of lower elevation, lower montane grasslands, like grassland sagebrush condition that go into park or woodland type communities. I think that we probably are seeing the dynamics of that underway right now, but we'll need disturbance events to push that in pulses. So I think grassland area will increase. Yes?
So I was curious if you would be willing to talk a little bit about some of the feedbacks that you might imagine to the climate system. So obviously there's the sort of classic CO2 increasing with fire frequency, and obviously if resilience changes, carbon storage is going to change, but the albedo effects can be really significant in these kinds of environments, and aerosol effects, things like that. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of sense for sort of state changing, going from a forest to maybe more of a shrubbier type condition, and albedo, carbon. I'm sure you have some carbon storage stuff, but any of those, because it seems like a really complicated story. It's not just a straightforward CO2 rises, fire, CO2 rises, warmer climate necessarily.
Correct. So I don't actually have a good answer to that, especially on the albedo side of things. I don't understand it enough, and I don't understand, I know the relative absorption versus relative reflection. But in terms of how much of the landscape would need to change before the albedo changes were sufficient to have a feedback back up, I don't know the answer to that. And if it's a patchy distribution as opposed to a very extensive one, I don't know. There are differences in the snow regime that happen as well, because you end up with changes in the phenology of snowmelt in areas that are open versus not, which is not part of what you asked, but it's part of related to the reflectance and to the water budget. So I'm not sure. And on the carbon dynamics, so yes, that is something that we have been thinking about. Interestingly, there's so much of the carbon is in the soils that even with the fires, you recover your carbon within the fire cycle. So if you can recover a forest within about 90 years, you're back to what you lost. So it's very important to consider the fire cycle. So people always say, well, more fire, you've sent up more carbon, or beetles, you've sent up more carbon. Yes, but you got to have succession in there as well. I don't know how the CO2 fertilization effect may interact with some of the climate changes there as well. So basically, I very much appreciate the complexity of it. We have been thinking about it. We have ideas, but I don't have anything that's nicely tied up. Yes?
So I'm curious about the feedbacks between changing fire regimes and the herbivore community, browsers and grazers, and how that could ultimately lead to some complicated and difficult feedbacks that may actually cause the system to collapse.
Yeah.
Because I don't do this, but my understanding is that browsers and grazers have a huge impact on the distribution of vegetation types in places like Yellowstone.
Right. So, and that's been an interesting topic for the elk browsing, especially in Yellowstone. So that's the one that's gotten a lot of attention, particularly up in the winter habitat of the animals, because that's where they're concentrated, and that's where their herbivory rates have been the most high. In terms of they don't have very much effect on the conifers at all. In terms of browsing, they like the aspen and the willows. Because the numerical values of the numerical response of the elk to not just wolves but multiple predators has now been pretty pronounced. I mean, the herd is down to about 3,000 animals on the northern range, whereas when following the 88 fires, it was up at about 16,000 or 17,000. So we have seen a tremendous reduction of browsing on the aspen up on the summer range, up in the lodgepole pine forests. So that has been an interesting contributor to recovery of aspen in these areas, because they had been browsed, for the first 10 or 15 years afterwards. So I think that it will be complex. I don't know how it will play out. I don't know if the herbivory would be enough to cause a transition on its own, or whether it would really be more of a direct effect of the climate, and the animals might be stuck if they don't have enough to eat. It's possible if climate warms that winter range conditions will become less limiting on some of the ungulates. So that could be an increase in population, but it's now being balanced by wolves, cougars, and grizzly bears. It's a multi-predator system. So very interesting, and it's one where I think we're lucky as a community of scientists that we have a system like this where the dynamics can be observed over time without much manipulation to see what happens. Yeah, good thoughts. Yes?
So it's kind of frightening to think that you have a 90% reduction in seedling pruning. On the other hand, in sites where you were getting 450,000 roots, right, obviously 10% may be just fine. Do you have a sense of how that reduction is going to play out? It could get worse or better than that relative to older size class?
I don't. And we have been trying, if any of you are reviewing my NSF proposals, please be kind. So we have been trying to get some of the work funded that would actually really allow us to go in and do that and actually develop, both like flesh out these mechanisms, get the field data to support at a rigorous level whether we're seeing changes that are consistent, and then play that out in a spatial framework on the landscape. So I really don't know, because I don't know what proportion of the landscape might be affected in this way, other than to say it's not going to be all of it, because we're going to have topographic refugia from anything. And you've got multiple contingencies. But from the park's perspective, that's the $60,000 question that they would like to know from us. So how much is going to change, and where is it going to change? What should we be thinking about and preparing for? So it's very much the direction that we want to go.
So what you just said leads to a question. If you were to try and give advice to the managers in Yellowstone, other than we can't predict things, would you start to actually at some point suggest some active management that would deal with some of these issues?
So if you couldn't hear, the question was, would I suggest active management in Yellowstone? And my answer is no. And the reason is that I think we have many, many places, and even in that ecosystem, we have national forests surrounding the area where we can go in and manipulate. And I think the value of our places like Yellowstone, Yosemite, and our wilderness areas is that they can be reference systems where we can see what the system does in the absence of management. So there are multiple opinions on this topic. I'm aware of that, but I would still maintain a hands-off perspective. Like, for example, the climate in the future for Yellowstone is projected to be very nice for ponderosa pine. We don't have ponderosa pine in that region at all, so its capacity to disperse there is limited. So people have said, well, we should bring it there and help it get established, and I would say no. But it's a good, I think it's still going to be a good policy discussion, and it's going to be one that plays out in the coming decades, or maybe less than that.
Yeah, this second sort of trivial question was just in the future, you base the assumptions on water deficit in terms of propensity for fire. Presumably fires primarily started by lightning. Is there any sense that there'll be the same lightning frequency? Any of the models actually get that
I have
down
no
into the
idea.
weeds?
I have not, I don't know if anybody, so the question is, what about lightning frequency and sources of ignition? I mean, there are lightning monitoring networks, but I have not seen anything that projected future lightning strikes for the region. I don't think they've been a limiting resource for the most part. Yes?
Which suggest more intense rainfall events. Whether or not that's more lightning-y, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yes?
Do you have any idea how changes in the hydrologic cycles and sediment inputs might be affecting aquatic environments?
Affecting it. So with fire regimes or with climate?
Fire.
With fire. So again, after the '88 fires, there was quite a lot of work that was done on the streams and the lakes, and the only places that they saw really big changes from sediment were in first-order streams that were completely burned, like the little watershed around them. But that local effect did not translate down into lakes, and it didn't translate out into bigger streams, and it had to so intense rainfall events had to happen in that particular place. If there was much heterogeneity in the fire, which there was often, then there was much less sedimentation and such in the streams. There were changes in the stream biota because of the light availability, more so than the nutrients. But on the whole, so Wayne Minshall from Idaho State, who's now retired, had done a lot of that work, and then Richard Lathrop, who I think is at Rutgers now, had done a lot of the lake level work, and basically said the system was quite resilient. It eventually does have coarse wood coming into it, of course, but that was not considered to be a detriment. Now, in the future, as it gets drier, there's a lot of concern because just I think as it is out here, if your snowpack is reduced and it's melting out earlier, the timing of your peak stream flow and the timing of water availability and the duration of drought, where any of your more ephemeral streams or wetlands and things dry out, may change. But I'm not aware of anybody that's actually started looking at those two things together with a response on the aquatics. Yes?
What's the conversation between ecologists and the fire management program there? Like, is there a way for ecologists to maybe say, like, we don't want tankers of, fire retardants to be dropped in stream areas and stuff? Nope. Yeah. Okay.
So what happens is the fire managers who work in Yellowstone, they know their system and they understand the dynamics. When a fire comes in and control gets passed to an incident commander that's brought in, they have nothing to say at all. And so, or I shouldn't say maybe at all, but they relinquish control very, very quickly. And so there are a number of things that have happened with fires in that area where we've had like crews come in, and so there's this heterogeneous burning pattern. They burn it out, which is like the absolute worst thing to do. So that heterogeneity is so functionally important for seed sources, for all sorts of things, and yet they'll burn that out. And so things like that, the park was unable to stop, which is kind of horrifying. Yeah, but the park people are good, and I think the experts, their goal is to get that fire out and be able to stand in front of the mic and say we did everything we could. Yeah. Yes?
You talked about using the regen patterns following the 1988 fires as a reference for current and future patterns. Is there any chance that those 1988 patterns were themselves anomalous and there was something in particular that year that caused the regen to be really good?
So I don't think they were anomalous in that we have been able to reconstruct stand densities based on dendrochronology work that go back and show that even forests that established in the 1800s and the 1700s often had very, very high densities, and then they either thin out or they recruit in if they start out low, and then they kind of end up converging by about 200 years at about 1200. Now that said, the weather conditions after the 88 fires during the summer of 1989 were an average to moist conditions, so growing conditions were quite good in the years subsequently. So I think if anything that would have at least allowed the seeds that got in there to establish pretty well, and I'm sure that there would have been variation in the past. But I don't think that, that it's anomalous necessarily. But also, for the past 100 years, there was very little young forest to be seen throughout the West, so there's not a lot of data out there on those density patterns. And as I mentioned, foresters would abhor that. They just wouldn't let it persist because it's not going to grow you merchantable trees very well. But the climate conditions throughout the 20th century were not conducive to big fires, and so we just didn't really have as much area to study.